Welcome everyone. This is the IMAP Invasive monthly webinar for October, and today we'll be focusing on how to use the Aquatic Invasive Species Ponds and Lakes Vulnerability Prioritization tool. So feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat box, and I think we'll get started with the presentation. So,
all right.
No, go to the next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So today, just to give a brief rundown of what we'll do today, so Jen's going to give an overview of the tool and then give a live demo. Then we're going to hear from Devin DiJacopo from the Lower Hudson Prism and T-Town, and he was on the advisory committee for the creation of this tool, and he also used the tool a little bit last summer, so he'll talk about the decisions he made in using the tool. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to use the data outputs. And with that, I'll hand it off to Jen.
Great, thanks. So wonderful. We're hoping that many of you that are here today were able to attend the webinar at 11 a.m., the statewide invasive species call, where Tim Howard and Amy Conley gave an excellent overview of this tool that we're going to go into more details on using here at this webinar. They talked in depth about the modeling methodology behind this, so I'm not going to go into any of those details, but I will give you a very, very brief and 10,000-foot overview of what this tool is and how it was, the thought behind how it was put together. And first, just pointing out that New York has a lot of aquatic resources, and it's something that weighs heavily on the minds of many of our invasive species managers or natural resource managers in general across the state. We are protecting our aquatic resources, and there are quite a few invasive species that are threatening those aquatic resources. And we did see a need for a prioritization tool that would help managers hone in on what aquatic resources they would prioritize for survey and management. And so for this tool, we did decide to focus on the ponds and lakes and reservoirs. So we have over 8,600 of those, and that was a good place to start. And I'll jump into our framework. And so we did look into the literature to see what existing frameworks for prioritization other aquatic managers have been using. And we found this great one by Van der Zanden and Olden from 2008, where they looked at factors that influence the introduction of invasive species to water bodies, whether or not those species will become established within those water bodies, and then if they do become established, what impact would those establishments have? And so by going through this process, it leads you to the vulnerability of a particular lake or water body. And so we applied this to spatial data that we have available to us at the statewide level. So we have spatial data related to the spread and risk, which would apply to the introduction of aquatic invasive species. We looked at created habitat suitability models for a suite of 8 surrogate invasive species to model the framework component of establishment. And then for impact, we looked at several factors that are related to the biological and recreational importance or quality of lakes and ponds across the state. And so all of those help lead to our management priorities. And we do have this available on our website, the imapinvasives.org. We have hot off the press, we now have a button for the AIS, or the Aquatic Invasive Species Vulnerability Prioritization, that will lead you to the website that Tim and Amy showcased in their talk earlier today, where, so I have the direct link for that as well up there. And so I'm going to do a deeper dive into this great tool that was created with those modeled outputs. But before I do that, I wanted to give everyone kind of a lay of the land of this tool. And so if you look on the left-hand side, these this is going to be really important when you use this tool, because this is where your user selections come into play. And so this is a very user-driven tool. You get to select what geographic region you're most interested in, whether it's the whole state or particular prisms. You select your threshold for the risk of introduction, the risk of establishment, and those potential impacts. So that left-hand slider or side of the tool is going to be very important for you to kind of wrap your head around if you and interpret, you know, as you use the outputs of this tool. The histograms that show for each of those different risk components or components of the threshold are also important to help guide your selection of the thresholds of each of those modeled outputs. And so we'll go into that a little bit more when we do the live demo of the tool. The boxes across the top are all intentionally color-coded to match these different components of the framework, and they show you how many lakes are filtered by your selections at that given time. And this is all interactive, and you know, as soon as you change a slider somewhere, it will update those numbers. The map, of course, shows the results of those user selections, so you can zoom in to see the lake details and so forth. And you can also toggle off and on the different map layers, which represent the lakes that are indicated by your user selections. And then last but not least, when you're finished with filtering to the thresholds that you're interested in, then you can generate a report and also download the results of those user-driven selections. All right, with that, I'm going to jump into the actual tool itself. So I'll get out of this PowerPoint and go to my web browser. So I'm starting here from our nyimapinvasives.org homepage. There are, of course, lots of selections across the top. If you go to the data and maps, there's a selection for species, tiers, and prioritization. And so that will scroll you to our different prioritization tools that we have available by location, species, and project. And so under location, this is where that AIS vulnerability prioritization button comes into play. And this launches the project page that, you know, describing all the methodology and so forth behind this tool that was created. So the long title of this is the Aquatic Invasive Species Pond and Lake Vulnerability Prioritization for New York. This page is really important if you intend to use the tool and interpret its results, because there's a lot of nuance with all this, and a lot of details that go into it that you really need to kind of digest as you work through the selections and try to implement the results. So, it's very important that you read this. You get project need and background, a little bit about our steering committee. But once you get down to the methodological approach, this is where you can start really getting into some of the nitty-gritty stuff that Tim and Amy really went into in depth in our webinar earlier today. But it also includes links to many of the data sets that we use, so that the baseline pond and lake data set from the Nature Conservancy is linked here. You have a table showing all the variables used for each component of the framework and the weights applied. There's also links to the supplemental information, which is all the predictors for all of those 8,600 lakes and ponds. Under that component two, the lakes suitable for establishment, this is where we have the habitat suitability models for those 8 proxy species. There's a link to the species model metadata in there. So that goes into more detail about those models in particular. And then, let's see, as I scroll on through, like I said, there's a lot of good information. You get down to the online tool, or the online prioritization tool instructions. And so this is what we're going to cover today, and this is available to you to come back to at any point. So as I go all the way through this, there's a link at the top and a link at the bottom to actually launch the tool. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that online tool, and you get a pop-up with even more important information to read through. You know, we just want to make sure that everyone understands the concepts behind this model and its limitations and how you can employ it. So I go ahead and accept that. And then here I am in the tool itself. So there's a lot going on. And as I mentioned before, this left-hand side is going to be very important. And so it's listed in the order that you want to address these. So the first selection on here is region. So if I open this up, this is optional. It currently defaults to all 8,683 lakes that we modeled out in this project. But if I toggle that to filter by prism, then I get the option to select different regions. So say I could select the capital region prism, and then it would zoom into the capital region and show me the ponds and lakes. So now I have just 746 lakes, which is still an overwhelming task for any one aquatic invasive species manager to deal with, but it has zoomed in from that 8,600 lakes from before. And you can do multiple prisms if you'd like, and it'll you know, of course, increase that number. So once I have my geographic selection made, then the first step of the actual framework is that risk of introduction. And so these scores that you're going to see are relative numbers. The scores themselves don't have units, but they give you a you know, a likelihood that invasive species will be introduced into a particular lake or pond. And so this is based on many of those different variables that Tim and Amy talked about, like motorboat traffic, distance to known invasive species, and so forth. And so this slider here shows you your relative score for risk of introduction, and you can adjust your threshold, essentially. So as I adjust the score along there, you can see that the line on the corresponding histogram here moves. So that red line is moving. If I adjust it a little bit more, I get some more lakes. So now we see that, well, I guess first a little introduction to the histogram. So along the x-axis here, these are the relative scores for that risk of introduction. So I have split my histogram bar, or my slider bar, so that I have, you know, a certain selection of my threshold of risk of introduction. And the lakes that are in red are the few lakes that are above that threshold of introduction, a risk of introduction. So they have a higher risk, essentially, of introduction. And those lakes in blue, so going up on this x-axis, that's the count of number of lakes. Those are the lakes in the capital region that are below that level of risk of introduction. And these gray bars behind there are the state. If you looked at all the lakes across the state, that's the distribution of risk of introduction for all the lakes across the state, you know, just kind of as a reference there. And so, you know, I can continue to adjust this histogram so that maybe I want to, you know, look at most of the lakes in the region in terms of risk. Or I can, you know, of course, go back and slim that down a little bit, or maybe I want just to look at, say, the top, I don't know, 10% of lakes, or close to that. And you can see that the number of lakes here that are in these in these colorful boxes, the red box shows you the lakes that have been filtered down based on your threshold of risk. And so now we have 78 lakes, so about 10% of the lakes that we started with. I can also go over to this map and I can turn off all of the lakes, all those background lakes that are not included in my 78 filtered down lakes for risk of introduction. All right, so moving on to our second component of the framework, which is establishment. And so if I click on that bar, it opens it up. And this is where we had our 8 proxy species, and each lake and pond is classified as having either a low, medium, or high model probability of suitability to each species based on those species distribution models. So say if I click hydrilla here, I will click hydrilla, then I get this slider bar that pops open. And so, like I said, we have the high, medium, low. You want to select what level of modeled probability of the suitability that you want to include. And so at the default, it goes to medium, and you can see now my green box is showing that there's 69 lakes that fall into that category. If I move that up to high, so making my threshold very high on those habitat suitability models, then that decreases the amount of lakes that are selected. Whereas if I did the opposite and I included the low suitability, then that's actually, anytime you select low, that will include all of the lakes that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and make this medium. And then if I turned on another species, say zebra mussel, that green number increased. So now it's up to 77. And this is because multiple species includes all lakes and ponds that meet the criteria for any of the species selected. So it's accumulative. I'll go ahead and turn that off and just focus on hydrilla here for a submerged aquatic invasive plants, and then move on to that third part of the framework, which is the potential for impact. And as a reminder, this score represents the potential impact of a new invasive species on the quality of that lake or pond, with values that reflect both the ecological condition and the recreational value of that water body. And once again, these scores that you see on the slider are relative scores. They don't have units, but this histogram is very helpful in selecting your threshold. So if I slide the slider back, you can start seeing that now my threshold has decreased, so it has a smaller number of lakes that are potentially impacted. So for this particular example, I see that my distribution of lakes with these impact of establishment scores is kind of bimodal. I have two major clumps there, so I'm going to adjust this slider so that I get that first clump of lakes that are impacted. So that gives me 32 lakes that are potentially impacted based on my selections here. And so turning our attention to the map, I can go ahead and turn off the other map layers to just leave the potentially impacted, so the final results of my filter selections showing here. And I can start to zoom in so that I can really get more understanding of these selections. And so you can see that, say, the water bodies that are in your 32 lakes potentially impacted selections are highlighted, and you can click on them now. And so the pop-up window with more information gives you the name for that water body. There are, of course, multiple databases with water body names, and so we tried to gather the two of the most popular names. So the GNIS name for this particular water body is the Colony Reservoir, whereas the Finn name, which is another database, is the Stony Reservoir. So just keep that in mind, that there might be names. It might say unnamed water body as well, which is very common. This also gives you the percentiles for both risk and impact. And so this is a high risk, it's in the 94th percentile. It also is relatively high impact if invaded, so in the 80th percentile. And this is a reservoir, probably for drinking water, so I would hope that it would be in a higher impact, or so higher ecological and recreational quality. Whereas, say, if I zoom in a little bit more, and we have some ponds over by a golf course, and if I select, say, if I click on one of those, this is an unnamed water body. It also has quite high risk, it's in a very suburban area, but its impact score is much lower. It's in that 53rd percentile there, but, which might be expected since it is in a golf course. All right, and of course, now that I have my 32 ponds and lakes that I want to further refine, I'm going to scroll down here on this left-hand side and get more information about my results. So there's a button to generate the report for this particular selection. This will go into your computer downloads, so check your downloads and then this will be an HTML file that you can click on and will open up in your browser tab. And what this does is it gives you a documentation of the selections that you made. So it shows that I started with 746 lakes in the capital region. You know, if I would have started with all the 8,000 some lakes in New York State, it would indicate that. It shows me what my risk of introduction value is that I selected on that slider bar and how many lakes that resulted in. The risk of establishment actually refers to the list of proxy species. And so you can see for the suitability level chosen, hydrilla is the only one that I chose for this particular selection. If I have multiple species, they would also have a suitability level that I chose. And then coming back up to this top table, the impact of invasion, you can see the value that I selected as my threshold and the final qualifying lake for that. All right, and if I go back to the tool, the final thing I'll show you is the download of results. So I can click that, and what that will do is give me another download, of course, a CSV file that shows all those lakes, those 32 lakes, and the model results. And then it also has some GIS, the GIS layer behind that. And Mitch is actually going to go into those data outputs in more detail. But first, before we get to that, we're going to switch over to Devin, who's the Lower Hudson's Aquatic Invasive Species Manager, and he's going to give us a case study from the Lower Hudson Prism on using this tool.
And before we switch to that, there were a couple questions in the chat. And so one like more general one that I think we could discuss a little bit right now, and some of it might, like Devin's presentation might illustrate some of these things too. But so there's these sliders with a bunch of numbers, and the numbers don't necessarily relate to anything concrete that we can point to. It's more relative. So how can you go about picking thresholds?
That's a great question. So these are relative, like Mitch said, these are relative scores, and they are unitless. So the numbers themselves aren't of significance, except for that they're relative to each other. So that's why we included the histogram to show the distribution spread of how those particular scores relate to the lakes within your current selection. And so you know, I kind of like to use percentages, so say for risk of introduction, if I were, say I was an aquatic manager for my prism, and I wanted to look at where I should focus my rake toss surveys for that upcoming season. And I know I have a lot of lakes, but I have made a decision, you know, maybe with my work group as well, to focus on the top 10% of lakes that have the highest risk of introduction. You know, and so that's a choice that we make as managers, and it could be anything. That's very arbitrary, of course. Like maybe you want to focus on the top 25% of lakes with the highest risk, or something of that sort. And so that's when you can use those sliders to then see what the resulting number of lakes are. Like if I have this number of 1.7, it's only giving me 7 lakes at risk of introduction. And you can see on the histogram, you can hardly even see where those 7 lakes are. So this is only 1% of the total lakes within my prism, which is maybe what you want to focus on. But perhaps you want a wider breadth to start with as your first funneling. And so, you know, this gets closer to like 50 or 60% of the lakes within my prism. And it's still quite a few, of course, but, you know, maybe your next selections are more important for your particular use case, like that, the risk of establishment or the potential impact. So I guess the answer is there's not really one answer. It is based on your priorities, and you know, you can kind of play around with the tool to figure out like if there are ways that it meets your uses best. And the nice thing is, you know, that you can have that documentation of what your selection criteria are by running that report, you know, so that you can replicate it. because you know, even though these are relative and you're kind of, you know, you can slide it back and forth, once you land on something, you do want to keep track of which numbers you did end up landing on in case you want to, like, each season then rerun that same analysis.
Thank you. And then one other question that I can address quickly is where the suitability comes from. So these aren't known suitability values, they're modeled estimates. So for each of those 8 species, we have data in IMAP of what lakes they're found in, right, what lakes and ponds they're found in. And then for each of those lakes and ponds, we also have a series of environmental factors. And so with that information, habitat or species distribution models were run so that we got basically a score of what's the likelihood that that water body is suitable to the certain species. And so that was kind of a continuous score, and then through expert review, we set thresholds for at what score is it considered highly suitable or medium suitability. And there's a lot of details that go into that, so there's more information on our webpage about that. And with that, I think we'll go to the next section.
All right. Am I sharing my slides, or Devin, did you want to share your slides?
I guess it would probably make most sense for me to share.
Okay.
It's in the same PowerPoint, but just so that I can flip through, I guess that makes sense.
Perfect.
Sure.
Okay.
And thank you. And while you're getting that queued up, I'll just segue into your section. So next, we're really happy to hear from Devin DeJacopo he's the AIS project coordinator for the Lower Hudson Prism and works for T-Town. And he was part of the advisory committee and is going to share how he has used this tool in the past summer. So take it away, Devin.
All right. Yeah. Well, first, thank you to the Natural Heritage Program for putting so much work into building this tool and for letting me talk to all of you a little bit about how we used it. This was exciting for me coming into this position, as I didn't have a lot of firsthand experience with the water bodies in my region and had a pretty short window to plan my field season. So a large part of my job as the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator is water body surveys. We do some management and the Watercraft Inspection Steward Program, but probably the majority of the work we do are these surveys. And we really have 2 goals with our surveys. And first is to provide an updated understanding of the distribution of aquatic invasive species in our region. And there we have a really heavy focus on early detection and rapid response. Another goal of ours is to collect baseline data on native communities to understand the impact of ongoing and future invasions. So those 2 goals really guided how we use the filters in this tool and chose our export. So to conduct these surveys, we do full inventories of aquatic vegetation, both native and invasive. We use point intercept method, which you can see an example of on the right. We have 1 point per acre in these water bodies that we visit. Use rake tosses to sample vegetation, and then time permitting, we'll also sample zooplankton, shelled invertebrates, fish, and do some water quality sampling. And with my 6-person crew, including myself, we can cover about 120 points in a day. And at max, a water body that is 500 acres. So for instance, Lake Mayapack was about 520 acres. We were able to get 120 points there, but that was about as stretched thin as we could be. And then in a season, we can cover about 25 to 30 water bodies. We go to each water body twice per season to account for changes in the plant community. And so hopefully these goals and limitations to what we can accomplish in our surveys will illustrate sort of how we filtered, and how we looked at the data after it was exported. Okay, so before the model was released, the way we sort of work through the water bodies in our region is we have a 3-year rotating list where we revisit all of the water bodies that have been surveyed in the past and reconduct our surveys. So you can see most of the sites in this table are from 2019, were visited in 2019. And so we're up again for survey in 2022. There are some instances where we survey more frequently, depending on sort of partner requests or special projects that happen at these lakes. But for the most part, it's a 3-year rotation. And then each year, we also entertain partner requests for surveys. So, you know, sometimes these are private ponds where an invasive species has all of a sudden taken over, or there's a research project that is ongoing where, you know, the investigators need help surveying more water bodies. Sometimes our subcontracts that the prison puts out require us to be, you know, to do additional surveys. And so on and so forth. And so the partner requests, the 8 requests I've listed below the table were ones from this year that for various reasons we had agreed to go survey. So in total, before even using this model, we had about 24 water bodies on the docket. And I said we could handle about 25 to 30 approximately. So we wanted to add a few more. And I was very excited when this model came out. It really helped us to make those decisions. So the first thing we did was filter to the Lower Hudson Prism, of course. You can see we started with almost 1,300 water bodies. And then we started our filtering. Risk of introduction, if you'll remember, I said we had a high focus on early detection and rapid response. So risk of introduction is huge for us. We want to be going where new invaders are likely to land. And so we put a really heavy weight on risk of introduction. We filtered out 93% of the water bodies in our region, leaving us with a sort of top 100 list of where invasive species are likely to arrive. And again, in terms of like how much we chopped out here, a lot of this was just what's feasible for us to sort through at the end. And so we thought, you know, starting with the top 100 would be reasonable. Moving on to suitability for establishment. You know, again, in looking at our 8 model species for suitability, I mentioned that vegetation is really our focus, but we are, you know, interested in all aquatic invasive species. If we get a report, we will respond to animal invaders. We've done some work with northern snakehead. So I did want them included in the model. So we left all of those in, and then we set our suitability thresholds from low to high, meaning we didn't filter anything out based on establishment. And I did this because, again, we want to know where these new invaders are landing, even if they're not establishing. If something arrives in a really popular lake but doesn't last through the winter, we still want to know that it was there. We want to know where these propagules are landing to inform where we put our resources in the future. But I did play around with this and you know, changed the thresholds from low to high to medium to high or all high, and it only knocked out, if I put all of these up to high only, it only knocked out one lake. So which sort of makes sense. It basically means that any of these 97 lakes had at least one proxy species with a high suitability of establishment, not super surprising. So we didn't really knock much out in terms of establishment. Okay, and then finally moving on to impact of invasion. If you'll remember, I said our other goal was to gather baseline data on Native communities. And sort of overall, we're really trying to protect resources of high value, either in terms of the natural resource or in terms of public access. So while we'll respond to many different types of reports of new invaders, when we're planning out our sort of standard rotation of surveys, we do want to focus on the lakes of high value, or the lakes that are most likely to be impacted. And so this was another big filtering point. We knocked out an additional 34, we knocked out 34% of the remaining lakes when looking at this last filter, and that left us with a top 64 list for export. We could have pushed it a little bit farther, but again, we knew that basically we could just sort by the total score at the end and just look at the top scores anyway. So we figured better to have a little more data and not cut out too much. So we left it with the top 64 there. And I'm just sort of displaying our top 30. This is the export from the model in Excel. And I've hidden a bunch of the extra data, just including some of the sum risks and the total score, which is how we sorted the table here. And then you can see a little bit of the extra work that me and my crew leader did in the preseason, sort of sorting between what we're already surveying, what would work, what wouldn't work. And that's what the color coding is here, and the notes on the rightmost column. So for instance, the red are any sort of red flag, something where it's probably going to be more hassle than it's worth, at least for this year, with so few survey slots left. So you can see the highest ranking water body, for instance, Muscoot Reservoir, is almost 3,000 acres. That's just too big for us to survey with any sort of adequate coverage. Similar thing for Conisco Reservoir. Some of these other red highlighted water bodies are in some cases too small. In some cases, they're it looks like they have either dried up or are actually just the backwaters of a stream or river. We tend to focus on lakes and ponds. We're in our canoes with our point intercept survey methods. We're not really effective, or at least not that efficient in river systems. So for all these various reasons, we sorted out these ones in red. And then we sort of learned a lot going through the others. For one, we noticed that a lot of the high-ranking water bodies were already in our rotation. So it seems like my predecessor was sort of onto something, had a good idea of what water bodies were important and likely to be invaded in the region, and which ones were going to be sort of too difficult or infeasible to get to and cover well. And then another thing I noticed, we did highlight our partner requests in yellow, and there were some farther down on our list, but they generally ranked very low. And as I was alluding to before, there are many reasons why we survey water bodies other than just where they would rank on this list, right? So we're trying to help our partners who so critically support us. So it's not the whole story, but it was a good reminder in the future to at least be critical of what partner requests we agree to. And this model was a great way to sort of double check where we were going. And so ultimately we added 5 lakes to our list. We had a few incidents this season of detecting a new species and sort of having to redirect a lot of our time and resources to addressing that. And so the only one of those 5 we selected that we actually got to was Sturgeon Pool. And it was free of invasive species, I'm happy to say. But some of these others I hope to work into the rotation as we go forward. And that is pretty much all I have. I've included my email and phone number here if people want to reach out, but I would be happy to answer questions either now or at the end of the segment, whatever the hosts would prefer.
Thanks so much, Devin. That was great. I don't see any questions specific to you right now, but if anybody has any questions about Devin's thought process using the tool or any of the decisions he made, please feel free to enter those into the chat, and we can answer some in the chat box and also talk about them at the end. And so now I'll move on to the last section before the Q&A, which should be pretty short. It's about using the outputs that both Jen and Devin mentioned. So on the model, or using the prioritization tool, you start with a bunch of lakes, and then you filter down to a list of lakes which are high priority according to the thresholds that you picked throughout your use of the tool. So I did a quick run where I filtered on Slilo lakes, and then I set some thresholds, and I eventually got down to 40 lakes and ponds. And so, as Jen pointed out, there's a generate report button and a download results button. And I wanted to emphasize that those relate to those 40 water, or to the subset of water bodies you get at the end. So for instance, when I click download results, I get information on just those 40 water bodies. So it's really important to pay attention to the number you've gotten to and to the water bodies you've gotten to at the end. For instance, if I just opened the tool and then went to download, it wouldn't give me anything because I would have my 8,000 lakes over here on the left, but I would have 0, 0, 0. So it would just, usually it says like the download failed. Depending on which browser, it can be a little bit different. But if you've gone through the model and you get to your lakes potentially impacted at the end, then you click the download results, you'll get the zipped folder with the 2 files that Jen showed. And Jen mentioned the CSV, which has a list. So in the case of this example, it would be 40 different water bodies, so 40 different rows, and then a bunch of columns for all the different fields. So some of those are more general information about the water body, identifying features, and then a lot of the values that went into the model and the risk scores for introduction and potential impact, etc. So that information is in the CSV, but that does not have the spatial information. So that comes separately as a .gpkg, so it's a geo package. So you'd need some sort of GIS software to look at that. I think most of us use ArcGIS programs. So you should be able to look at this in ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro. So for example, the general way to deal with this kind of file would be you connect to the folder from your GIS program, and then you add in the data. And for this geo package, there's actually 2 different layers that you can add in. So one would be points and one is polys. And so the polys are the polygons for the lakes, and then the points are just the centroids for each of those polygons. And so you can see that on the map here. I think I actually have both shown. So there's those pinkish polygons for lakes and then the green points. And you might see this giant lake right here, Oneida Lake. That's not lit up right now because it wasn't one of my 40 final lakes. So it's just the 40 lakes, not all the lakes in the region. And if you open up the attribute table for the points or the polys layer, you'll see the same columns that you see in the CSV. So it has all those different attributes there. But again, just for the final lakes on your filtered list. So you might have some questions at this point. So there's many, many different columns. I think there are over 50. You might not know what each of those columns mean. For instance, what does num ID mean? And you might also want information on the rest of the water bodies. And so for any of that sort of information, you can go back to our main project page. And it is aquatic invasive prioritization, but aquatic prioritization also redirects to that page, so that's often what I use just since it's shorter. But you can also get it there from the NYIMAP page like Jen showed at the beginning. And so at the bottom of this page, and throughout, there are links to other information. And they're kind of all included at the end, which is why that's where I'm directing to right now, because it's kind of all laid out there at the last couple sentences. So there's the spatial information for all of the water bodies, included the analysis, which is a geodatabase. There's the full attribute table for all of the water bodies included in the analysis. And then there's the species model metadata. So I'll go through each of those quickly. The first thing is the spatial information. So that's a geodatabase, .gdb. So you'll need a GIS software to use this file. So the general workflow would be to download the zipped file, unzip it, connect to that folder and add the database from your GIS program of your choice, and then add the data to the map. And again, you'll have two different options. You'll have points and polygons. So the polygons would be the polygon data for the over 8,000 water bodies, and then the points are the centroids, which is sometimes easier to visualize because the tiny lakes and ponds kind of get lost in the polygon view when you're looking way zoomed out, but with the points you can see them all. And you can open up the attribute table for either of these layers, and you'll see these fields, but it actually doesn't have the full field. So this is all there is. It's 8 different fields. So it doesn't have all of that additional attribute data. It's really just the spatial information here, and some really important identifiers. So the num ID, which I'll mention in a second. Sorry, I was skipping forward. So the next thing is the full attribute table, which is the second thing at the bottom here. It's also listed as supplemental information elsewhere on the web page. And something really important is that this includes all the field definitions. So when you download this, it's a spreadsheet. The first tab has field definitions for each of these things. So the num ID is a unique identifier for the lake. You get all these intermediate values like the modeled risk from boat traffic, and then the summed risk for each of those components, the predicted probability of habitat suitability for each of the species, etc. And if you go on the second tab, that's where you can find the full attribute table. So this is just like the CSV that comes out when you click the download results button on the model, except it includes all 8,000 plus water bodies. And so it has all those many, I think over 50 different fields, and you can look at the definitions in that first tab, which is really important for making sure you're interpreting the results correctly. And if you want to join all this information doesn't really have the spatial component in it directly, so if you want to join the spatial information, which doesn't have the full attributes, to the full attribute table, which doesn't have the spatial information, you use the num ID. So that's the unique identifier that's found in the geodatabase as well as the spreadsheet. And then the last thing linked on that main web page is the species model metadata. And this gives you more detailed information on the modeling for each of those, I think it's 8 different proxy species. So these are models. None of them are 100% accurate, of course, so it kind of gives you more information on what data went into it, what's the overall performance of the model, what does the distribution map, the predicted distribution map look like for the model, all that sorts of information and statistical information as well. And that was all I had for the data products. So I'll just do some closing points, and then we'll get into some discussion. One point is to remember that the scores are relative. So really what you want to do is look at the histograms and think about how many lakes you're filtering out and how many lakes and ponds you're filtering to, I guess. So for instance, the top 10% for introduction risk, that would be one way to think about setting your threshold for the introduction risk. Interpret the results carefully. So they're meant to assist with your decision-making process, but they're not supposed to replace your decision-making process. So Devin gave some really great examples of how he carefully thought through the model and thought through thresholds and got to the results, but he didn't just take the results at face value. He kind of worked them into his existing process and thought about how the model could help, but didn't let it stop him from going to other water bodies, which he deemed important to visit for other reasons, which the model won't capture. And then if you're using the intermediate data, so all those many different fields available in the exports, make sure you read the definitions and in the metadata tab very carefully to make sure you're using results in a way that makes sense with how those results were calculated. And then just as a closing, some potential benefits of using this prioritization tool or any prioritization tool is that it can help conceptualize multiple factors at once. It can help you document your decision-making process and make it more explicitly data-driven, and it can provide some consistency across different groups if people are using similar or the same prioritization tools, but there are certainly some caveats. So the models are limited by what data we have available, and also there's no substitute for expert judgment. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions. It looks like there's a lot of discussion in the chat.
Great.
And thank you so much to Jen and Devin for presenting as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's been some great questions in the chat, and we are lucky to have Tim and Amy, the creators of the model and tool, on the webinar today, and they've been answering questions as we go. And so there were some questions about, really how you select your introduction of risk. And then I did not get, Nicole was wondering, how do you compare the model results to existing populations, I'm presuming, of invasive species. And Tim did put a response in there that you could choose lakes with higher suitability than the ones you already know are invaded. Excellent. And one thing I was thinking when I was reading Nicole's question is that, and because Mitch was talking about all this information that you could open up into ArcGIS or some type of GIS software, you could have the your modeled results, and you could also bring in the web map service from IMAP Invasive of the known locations of the particular species that you're interested in. So you could do a spatial analysis that way as well.
I'm just putting a link to the WMS into the chat for anyone interested in more information on that.
And Steve is asking about a future version. It's always good to start thinking about the future. Wondering if there could be a regional filter that could include towns and cities instead of just prisons. Certainly something that we could add to the wish list. And, we'll probably revisit this in, a few years to update the data and so forth, and we can, make those decisions with the work group and try to evaluate, what are the best use case scenarios and what kind of improvements could be made to the filtering selections on the tool to help make those easier for regional managers.